One of the things I loved about raising kids was telling them stories. I was constantly telling them a story about something. And one of my favorite parts of telling my kids stories was they'd be like, Dad, tell it again, tell it again, tell it again. And I'd tell it again. And they'd laugh and I'd tell it again. One day we were driving through a town. And I said, this is Goose Town. They laughed. Goose Town. Who would name their town Goose Town? And moments later, I pulled out and I said, that's where I hit the ball in Little League, the furthest of any ball I ever hit. Oh, Dad, how far did you hit that ball? Oh, I hit it way out there. It almost landed at the road. Dad, was it a home run? I said, no, it was foul. Tell the story again, Daddy. Please tell it again. We have stories we tell in our family, and we tell them again and we tell them again. I hope you have stories that you tell in your family. If you don't, I'm hoping that as a result of our time over the next couple minutes, that you'll have stories that start coming to your mind that you tell over and over again. You ask my kids about the ladder, and they will tell you of that Sunday morning we were headed to church, and the freeways were empty. Never have to wait through a traffic light to get to church, right? No one's out at this hour in the morning on a Sunday morning. And the freeway was empty that morning. We're coming up behind a truck, and all of a sudden, everyone's leaning forward in the car. I don't know if you ever have those kinds of moments. Everyone's leaning forward. We're having a conversation about something. Everyone at this moment's looking out through the front windshield, and there in front of us on that truck is a ladder, and just at that moment, that ladder releases and starts heading straight out, flying through the air towards us. Before I could even respond by moving my vehicle, that ladder landed over there. And we as a family just went, oh. And we knew that something had happened at that moment that only God could have done. And we repeat that story. We repeat the stories of God. In the book of the Psalms, the 78th Psalm, if you have your Bible, I'd love for you to turn there. Psalm 78, a guy by the name of Asaph talks about telling the stories of God, something only God can do. And as Asaph tells this story, I would love for you to listen in on it. I'm going to read the first 7 verses. But if you get a chance later on today, read the rest of the chapter. I'll talk about the rest of the chapter for just a moment. Psalm 78:1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I utter dark sayings from old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our kids, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach the children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn. And arise and tell them to your children, so that they should, listen carefully, set their hope in God, not forget the works of God, but rather to keep his commandments. If you want to remember what I'm going to say this morning, really simple. Tell the stories of God, tell the stories of God, tell them again, just keep on telling them. This whole book is the story of God. Doesn't matter where you're reading in there, there's a story in here that you need to repeat, that you need to tell over again. But Asaph, at the end of this chapter, for the rest of this chapter really, begins to tell the stories of God. The stories that God's people repeated over and over and over again. I'll give you an example. He opens up talking about Egypt. Egypt was a dark time for Israel. God's people were in captivity there. They were slaves there. It was a miserable time. And then he begins to talk about these miracles that happened there, these miracles, these things that happened like grasshoppers and rivers turning to blood and just crazy stuff like that. And then he begins to talk about how Moses would go to Pharaoh. When I was a boy, parents asked me a question when I get in the car. You probably ask your kids this question. What'd you learn in Sunday school today? I'd say, Moses. Every week, Moses. It was always Moses. The kid, I thought that was a bad thing. I was like, isn't there more in here than Moses? But what Asaph's going to teach us by even starting with Moses, when he begins to talk about the stories of God, he reminds us of something the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. He says, now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. In fact, what God's doing when he's telling us these stories about real people like you and me that lived a long time ago, how did God deal with them? How did God work with them? How did they respond when God did certain things? Asaph tells this story in Psalm 78, reminds them of a story they were well familiar with about how Pharaoh finally says, yeah, just get out of here. You can stop being slaves. You can leave here. Just go. And God's people begin to leave, and they get down to the Red Sea. And all of a sudden they look at this sea and they're like, we can't go anywhere. They look behind them, and Pharaoh had changed his mind. The armies are coming and just about ready to swallow them up. They're scared, like, why'd we ever do this? We should have never gotten ourselves into this situation. When just then, looking out, the waters of the Red Sea pile up on either side, and the people just realize, boy, we can go down through dry land to cross over this Red Sea. They're getting halfway across the Red Sea, and they look behind them, and they go, whoops, we didn't give this much of a thought. They're following us into the water, and they're going to kill us, whether it's in here on the dry land or on the other side. We're still goners. We're dead. They finally get through, and the last Israelite gets through to the other side, and just like that, the waters come down over the armies of Egypt. And they tell this story over and over. Then they go into this time where they're out in the middle of the desert. God provides for them water from a rock. God provides them manna from the heavens, provides for them meat in the desert every day. He provides for them a cloud that they can follow around by day and a pillar of fire by night. Tell these stories to your children. He's going to tell you that through the rest of this chapter. And even as you read this chapter, if all you did was look at the stories that are mentioned in this chapter and repeat those stories, look up those stories, study those stories, know those stories, and tell those stories just like I just told you that story, and you tell them to your kids. When you tell them over and over, what they get to understanding is that God was faithful and took care of his people. So much so that later on, this is so cool, there would be this feast set up. These are national celebrations for Israel where they would come together to remember an aspect of God's faithfulness. They would set up this feast called the Feast of Booths. We would just call this a big camping trip. They would go back out into the wilderness, back into the desert. They would set up a tent, just like their forefathers have had back in that very desert, how their forefathers had a time there where they were out in the wilderness, and they would set up a tent with their family, people that had never gone through that desert experience, and they would retell the stories of what God did there, how God protected them, how God had provided for them.